Welcome to the Democracy's College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in P20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu. In this episode, Dr. Heather Fox at OCCRL talks with Dr. Elvira Abrica, Assistant Professor of Higher Education and Organizational Change at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, about the lived experiences of immigrant, migrant, and multicultural populations in post-secondary education.
Your research focuses on underserved student populations, including immigrant, migrant, and multicultural populations in post-secondary education, with an emphasis on Latina and Latino students. I'd like to start by spending some time talking about what you have learned about these underserved populations and what you see as a potential means to improve outcomes for these students. Can you talk about why you study the post-secondary experiences of underserved populations and highlight some of the themes you see in post-secondary experiences of Latina and Latino and immigrant students?
Sure. I focus my research on Latino and Latino students, specifically around issues of race, ethnicity, and immigrant background. And, first, it's important to recognize that Latinos are not all immigrants. And I think sometimes in the higher education discourse, we talk about Latinos as if they're inherently all undocumented or all foreign-born. And that's just not the case. We know that since the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that Mexicans in particular have been in the U.S. since parts of it were Mexico. So California, Texas, these were Mexico, and they became U.S. states. And so there's some indigeneity around the Latino population that often doesn't get looked at. So Latinos is a broad term. It's a broad category that we use to sort of capture both the immigrant experience as well as those who are later generation Mexican American, later generation folks of other ethnicities. And so in my work, I try to kind of tease out the salience or the significance of immigrant background, particularly as it shapes how people are racialized in the U.S. and how they respond to that racialization. So my research has focused a lot on the intersection of race and ethnicity and immigrant background. Initially, I started doing research on later generation Mexican Americans. That's how I identify as a later generation Mexican American woman. So I centered my research on those folks and seeing what are some of the educational experiences of later generation Mexican Americans. And in doing research in California, I learned that a lot of the college student population are actually children of immigrant parents. So those would be referred to as second generation, predominantly Mexican. And that's not to say that I don't mean to equate Latinos with Mexicans, but Mexicans are the largest ethnic group, particularly in places like California. And so in learning that most college students are second generation children of Mexican immigrant parents, I started to observe sort of differences in how these participants talked about race and the salience of race in their experience. I started to kind of want to explore more deeply how immigrant background or the proximity to an immigrant experience kind of informs how you think about yourself as a racialized individual and how you respond to racializing experiences. And so really, I think there's no way to kind of, for brevity, I wish I could say I study Latino students, but I think in essence, I study the nuances of ethnicity, immigrant background, and race, how race is experienced among Latino students in higher ed. And I think the significance of this in higher education is to understand how those experiences, being a child of an immigrant parent, for example, or being a later generation Latino student, how those individual experiences sort of shape how we engage with the institutions we attend. And so that's where my research centers, is wanting to see what are the nuances of the Latino college student experience, either in community colleges or four-year institutions, and how does a proximity to an immigrant background, ethnic identity, and one's perception of themselves as racialized, how do those things kind of coalesce to inform how they engage with post-secondary institutions?
I really love how in that description you talked about the error we make in associating Latinos and immigrants as being kind of equivalent populations, a 101, and how not all Latinos are immigrants. We're indigenous in a lot of areas in our country, and if they may be children of immigrants as well. So you're really talking about three different populations. And I just want to flip it and highlight the fact that obviously not all immigrants are Latinos either, right? I think a lot of times in our country when we talk about immigrants, we make the assumption that we're talking about the Latino population, or even more specifically the Mexican population. But while they're the largest population of immigrants, they're certainly not the holistic idea of the population of immigrants. So I just wanted to flip that in there. I think that we make two errors in our assumption and making that as a connection, which is
absolutely
not
absolutely. So much of the anti-immigrant rhetoric is racist in nature. It's anti-Mexican, it's anti-brown, it's anti-people of color, it's anti-Muslim. It's inherently intertwined. And so I think that is the crux of my work, is to try to sort of untangle and unpack how these various identities and experiences in the U.S. inform how individuals are able to navigate post-secondary institutions, really thinking about how identities intersect with social institutions and how the institution is receiving those identities and racializing these individuals. But then also, individuals have agency, and so how are the individuals then, based on how they're treated in those environments, how do they respond to those, as I said, racializing experiences? And so I think that's really the heart of what I am trying to study in my work, is to get out the interaction between the institution and the individuals with regard to the construction of marginalized identities, such as a racialized status, the ways in which immigrant background is constructed as something negative and inherently something that's beneath others. And so those are kind of the ways in which I approach my research in higher education.
And your research is grounded in higher education, or the setting for your research is in higher education. So I'm wondering about that racialized experience specifically in terms of campus climate and how institutions either create or dissuade populations from succeeding on their campus.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of campus climate.
Sure. Well, we know that the campus environment is not perceived in the same ways by all individuals. And so students of color often perceive a more negative or hostile campus environment. And what I've tried to do in my research is try to see how one's identity sort of impacts how students perceive that climate. And so in my latest research, I've looked at how different dimensions of the campus climate, trying to measure different dimensions of the campus climate and trying to see how students' various social identities form the perceptions of a negative climate one way or another. So looking at LGBTQ status, looking at race, looking at gender, kind of seeing how these intersections of one's identity inform how they view the climate and different dimensions of the climate. And so I think inherently higher education institutions are, their very nature, their climate is so much informed by a historical legacy of racial discrimination and exclusion of people of color that a priori, the climate is going to be a highly racialized context. And so as students of color enter these contexts, they are met with experiences that people might often describe as racial microaggressions. This is a growing term that's sort of thrown around, which has been posited and developed by critical race theorists to name the experience of students of color on college campuses. And so I would say racial microaggressions definitely, we know, often characterize, unfortunately, the experiences of students of color within campus environments. And we know that those campus environments are very much shaped, as I said, by a historical legacy of racial discrimination and exclusion. So I think in my work, I try to kind of see how students make it through, right? So that we're not just telling a story about the climate is bad, this place is racist, and we don't make it. We know that people make it in spite of and because of those experiences. And so in my work, I've been looking a lot about how, as I kind of talked about, how students' perception of their racialized status, how that informs their engagement with particular resources. And so, for example, my dissertation study focused on Latino males in engineering, and I looked specifically about how they understand race as a construct, as an identity, and how they respond to racism in the context of engineering. And so what I found was that students often, these were Latino male students, they often were without the language to describe their experience. They didn't have any sort of context for saying, this was a racial microaggression, but that's indeed what it sounded like to me. And so they were often placed into Latino-based programs or attended things that were specific for Latinos, but without any understanding or retort when people approached them and said, why are you in that program? Why do you get unfair advantages? Why do you get tutoring? These sort of microaggressions, these assumptions that you're getting this unfair advantage, the students were without any recourse to explain why they are beneficiaries in some way of this additional support. And so I think that's where the complicated nature of race really informs how students engage with support and experience the climate on a college campus.
And I'm wondering, you studied specifically in engineering, which is part of STEM. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this racialized climate and the expectations around race impact students' pathways into and their resistance and resilience in STEM fields in particular, since there's such a move to try to increase underrepresented populations or underserved populations' engagement in STEM. How are their experiences different?
Right. Well, in STEM right now, what we have is so much push and so much emphasis on increasing the number of students of color in STEM fields. And arguably, a critical race theory perspective might posit that this is indeed an example of interest convergence, of this idea that we only need students of color now because it suits our economic interests. There's a lack of a highly skilled labor force, and therefore we need these populations that are growing in number to actually fill these spots. And so I've heard the argument that this period of pushing for students of color in STEM, this has been a problem for a very long time, but is only now gaining prominence because of the economic benefit to the U.S., to the U.S. national global imperialism, the economic standing of the U.S. Only now are students of color being talked about as being underrepresented in these fields. So I think first off, that's sort of the lens that I approach STEM with, is this idea that a lot of the talk about students of color in STEM is arguably very superficial. It's about increasing numbers. It's about increasing the amount of. It's about wanting more black people, more brown people in these seats and these degrees. But I don't hear as much talk about what will these students do with their degrees. Is there a pipeline to get them into whatever area or profession that they're interested in, either post-baccalaureate education or an employment area? I don't know that there's a lot of support post-baccalaureate degree for students of color that really would suggest we're truly invested in their transitioning into a STEM career. That's one thing. Secondly, I would say, this superficial inclusion, this counting, I think it doesn't account for the racialized experiences that students have in these contexts. And so when we talk about increasing the numbers of students of color in STEM, when we talk about needing more Latino students in STEM, that's great. I agree. But the concern I have is with the superficiality of counting and quantifying the number of Latinos rather than truly investing in their learning and actually thinking about the forms of wealth, the forms of capital that Latino students have and that they could bring to STEM fields. So our sort of as a Latino population, are there ways in which our experiences could be leveraged to inform the field? Are there ways in which the experiences of being underrepresented, of being racially marginalized, are there ways in which our very downtroddenness, for lack of a better term, is there ways in which that could be not exploited and not included as a way to seem like we are diverse, but could it be that we actually leverage our forms of community cultural wealth, and could there be more meaningful inclusion? So I guess that's the rub I have with that area of research, is kind of those two things, this sort of interest convergence and this superficial inclusion that I see.
So kind of along those same lines, colleges often employ universal improvements meant to lift all tides. Do you think that this approach will reduce equity gaps seen by immigrant students or by Latina and Latino students? And if not, what approach would you advocate for?
Well, when we talk about universal approaches, when we talk about things benefiting all students, I think we have to be very clear that those indeed benefit white middle-class students. That when we talk about something as being universal, there's just no such thing. By default, there is a white normative standard that universities sort of cater to. And so when we talk about there being some universal program that's for everybody, it in fact is usually catering in some way to, by default, it is catering to the student population who has been traditionally well served by post-secondary institutions. And so I would say definitely, this language of universal support, I think we have to be really honest and address who's in that universe, because it's certainly not the students that are in need of tailored support. And so I would say certainly there can't be, a university cannot make every individual happy at all times, in all contexts, in all circumstances, especially with diminishing state and federal resources. So I think definitely there is that tension there, that institutions cannot accommodate every single group or in every single constituency. But at the same time, I think with sort of talk about things being for all, we have to really be explicit about who benefits from those supposedly universal initiatives and be very honest that they are not for certain populations. And so I would advocate for models of support that include some recognition of the historical legacy of racial discrimination and exclusion upon which colleges and universities are founded. That, I think, has to be central, is sort of thinking about the historical legacy of the institutions that we're talking about, and then sort of understanding what is within our means to do. To what extent can we tailor supports for different populations? Because to suggest that all supports are for all people just doesn't seem true. And so I think being explicit about targeted efforts to support diverse student populations is where we need to be.
So much of your research is situated in community college contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Would you share what the significance of a community college setting is to your work and the populations that you study?
Well, I think community colleges are so important. I mean, in graduate degree programs, I don't know that they get enough airtime in the classrooms and in our curriculum. And certainly after I graduated from my doctoral program, I went to work at a community college. And it's from that experience of working at a community college I really saw the significance of these institutions beyond the few books or articles I had read. And I just completely traded what was perhaps a 4-year centric research agenda to an agenda that very much highlights the community college, because how could I not? These are such a significant sector of higher education. They enroll more students of color, more low-income students, what we often refer to as non-traditional students, So this is where, if we are talking about equity and opportunity for students of color or historically marginalized populations, we have to include community colleges in that conversation. Oftentimes when we talk about access and equity, we talk about access to four-year institutions, the most elite places. And certainly there should be equitable opportunity to access those places. But most of our students are at community colleges, and for a number of compelling reasons. They're affordable. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're more affordable than four-year options. And I think more and more students are choosing community colleges than the four-year institution. And I'll share with you this. I am currently conducting a study that's funded by the Center for the Study of Community Colleges. And as part of this grant study, I'm looking at all Nebraska community colleges and looking specifically at immigrant and migrant populations. And in interviewing a number of the students, some of whom are immigrants, some of them are children of immigrants, all of them are fall under the categories of either themselves or their parents are born outside the U.S. From countries like Latin America or Africa. They're just non-white, basically. And so in doing this research with immigrant students in Nebraska community colleges, what I heard one participant say just this past week was, the four-year model is obsolete. It is not a model that I want to be part of. And he had actually transferred from our four-year flagship institution, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, to the local community college. And so more and more I'm hearing the students in my study talk about the ineffectiveness of the four-year institution and how the community college is where they can do what they want to do, get the education they want, and get out without incurring so much debt. They talk about the four-year model becoming more and more obsolete, and all of these hustles that they have, like I need to work these many jobs, and I'm doing this, and I'm a YouTube star, and I'm doing all these different things, and they just seem to have such a sort of like an economic mind. They're brilliant in the way they talk about economics and the way they perceive economics of things, and just kind of thinking about the economy and the sort of opportunities that maybe a four-year can't even provide anymore. They've really convinced me that community colleges are the most significant institutional type in post-secondary education because of what they're able to provide to the masses. Are there problems with community colleges? Absolutely. We know this, that they too have their inefficiencies, but the more and more I talk to immigrant students in Nebraska, the more I hear about how it's just the most viable option for so many reasons, and it just makes more sense. So certainly I think community colleges are incredibly important, and they should be studied more in higher education, and they definitely are due a place of prominence on the national kind of political conversation or political realm.
Awesome. So given the significance of community colleges to the populations that you research, I'm wondering about the need to engage and train Latina and Latino community college faculty and community college leadership.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would say to that question, one thing I would encourage us to think about is not just the leadership or the faculty in community colleges, but also the institutional researchers. And somehow I've found myself, at UCLA I worked in the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment, and so for many years throughout my doctoral training I worked in this sort of assessment IR office. And so after I finished my doctorate, I went to a community college and worked in IR, and so I just saw from the inside how significant these units are on community colleges. And I think part of my agenda, almost not strategically and almost not even on purpose, has really focused on the role that institutional research offices play in the community college landscape. And so most recently I wrote a testimonial borrowing from critical race theory and methods within critical race theory. I wrote a testimonial as an IR professional, and I argued in that testimonial well, first I shared kind of my experience as an IR professional, as a woman of color, and then I talked about how, we often talk about faculty administrators, but IR stands to play a critically important role in promoting equity on community college campuses. And they're not often thought about. We often think about faculty, we often think about administrators, but I would argue that IR institutional research offices are key to advancing the equity agenda in community colleges. And I say that because they are the holders and keepers of data, and they're able to demonstrate what outcomes we're looking at and where do we want to be, how can we move the needle. And they're most equipped to be able to dictate, or they're most in a position to be able to say which groups need targeted intervention or which groups are disproportionately impacted. And, to what extent are those Latino colleagues being supported in their equity efforts? So I would say there needs to be some training and development around how to support Latino colleagues, how to engage in that work, how to be an ally, and how to really disrupt these systems that supposedly are invested in success of all students, but really perpetuate the status quo or continue business as usual. And I'll say, for example, with institutional research, Patrick Teranzini has written a lot about the competencies required of IR professionals, and he talks about how it's very important as an IR professional that you be seen as objective and neutral because you're the holder of all of the data. And so if you're seen as having a political agenda on a community college campus, that's a problem for people and how they view you. In my testimonial about IR as being an IR woman of color, I talk about how those competencies were not useful to me, and maybe it's okay that we're not seen as neutral. Maybe it's okay to be both an IR professional and an equity-minded practitioner. Because when we talk about equity-mindedness, that conversation often centers on faculty, equity-minded administrators, and that's great. But I think there's room to explore further, and my latest publications really kind of center on IR in community colleges and how we can become equity-minded IR professionals, which goes against the very socialization that Teranzini talks about, that others have upheld as this pillar of, neutrality.
Last question. Do you have a call to action for those who want to promote equitable outcomes for the populations of students you serve?
I would say that for the Latino population, I think we're often excluded from the discourse around opportunity. And nationally, when we talk about race and racism, it's often presented in this black-white binary. And so I would say the call to action I have is that Latinos need to be represented and need to be part of those conversations around the relationship between education, opportunity, social mobility, and they need to be inserted and disrupt that black-white binary that often informs conversations around race. And so I would say my call to action is just to insert Latinos in the rhetorical landscape around race, racism, and educational opportunity. That would be my call to action, is to say that though we are not black, not white, certainly there's rhetoric that is targeting Latino folks. And it's not about culture, it's about race. It's about, we talked about like the anti-immigrant sentiment. It's not just anti-immigrant, it's anti-Mexican immigrant. And so I think we're already part of this racial landscape, but we're not part of the discourse around race and racism. And there's no political power to say, we're here, and we're not going to be marginalized, even within the discussion about how to not marginalize people. So I think that's my call to action, is to really advocate for the insertion of Latinos within the rhetorical landscape around race and educational opportunity.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
Tune in next month when Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher talks with Dr. David Stovall, Professor of African American Studies and Education Policy Studies at University of Illinois at Chicago, about the influence of race in urban education, community development, and housing. Background music for this podcast is provided by DubLab. Thank you for listening and for your contributions to educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students.